Family and fellow soldiers, I'm the Professor, and this is the Moment of Truth. As those of you who have looked at the thumbnail or even the title of today's briefing know, this is not going to be a regular crime report. The reason why, and I know that this is going to grate on some people because nobody likes it whenever I seem to be responding to comments or commenters, I think that under the circumstances I ought to. This is a follow-up to yesterday's video, and it's just something that I wanted to add. Part of being B1, part of being all about black empowerment, is to root out weakness. I've been saying for a decade and a half now we have to take a hard-nosed approach to our power. And when you make no bones about your power, that also means you make no excuses about your weaknesses. Now, this is not just a standard that we apply to ourselves here in the US. We apply it to everyone. And the reason why is, if black people want to be strong as a group, there has to be a standard, and the standard has to go across the board. It can't apply to some and not to others. Now, for our African and immigrant brethren who understand exactly what it is the black media has been saying, people who didn't show up in the last 5 minutes, they understand exactly what's going on. Though I think there may be some new folk or some new plants who are pretending not to get it. If Africa is not a stronghold of black empowerment, if the African people are not super aggressive about making sure that they have privileges and that the playing field is totally and completely slanted in their favor in their own lands, then where is this going to happen? Because if it can't happen the easiest in Africa, where is it going to happen more easily at? Where will it happen at all? Land, economic opportunities, the ability to move people and goods at will, and have full governmental support in doing so, Africa should be the place where black people get all the prime cuts of real estate, access to resources, and every perk, advantage, and upper hand that a country can possibly give to its citizens. That's the entire point of citizenship. The leaders of the country are supposed to be maximizing all of those opportunities and benefits for those who are citizens. Now, this state of affairs does not exist for black people anywhere on this planet. And tragically, it doesn't even exist where black people originated at. And that's the problem. Blackness should be worth tens of millions of dollars in Africa. Africa happens to have more resources than any other place on Earth. It also has more land than North America, and truth be told, the actual industrialized portions of Europe as well. Blackness should be worth tens of millions of dollars. Instead, we see exactly the opposite. And that is not okay. People apparently didn't like it because I'm telling them that the status quo is unacceptable. But you have people who are too lazy to do what empowerment demands, so they make false accusations about being divisive, a word that we never hear when talking about tethers or these corrupt African misleaders when they attack black Americans, or when they refuse to unify with us when we come to Africa and try to get things going there. Nobody ever says the word divisive when talking about them. This is something that we always get whenever there are people who apparently feel that a little bit too much truth is being spoken, or perhaps a little too much truth about a subject that they actually care about. Now, if you want to get all in your feelings at me for saying that there's a culture of defeatism that's taken hold in Africa, then shouldn't you be infuriated at the bootlick sellouts and corruptocrats who have crippled Africa in the first place? How is it that my words apparently offend you more than their actions? I couldn't help but notice the same trend of the same people who recycle the old talking points and lies that we've seen for close to 40 years now. My personal favorite is those people trying to claim that, black Americans, they could get the same level of cooperation as, say, an Idris Elba or an Akon if they brought more money. Let me tell you something. Idris Elba didn't show up with a Brinks truck in tow. He basically brought his fame, and that's about it. That's what he had to do to get cooperation. Black Americans, on the other hand, never show up to Africa empty-handed. I can show you black people I know who went to Africa with their life savings, which is more than an entire African village has combined, or black investors and business types who have had upwards of $250,000 to $2 million ready to go. All they wanted was land to begin their venture. The same thing that these African countries give to foreigners from Asia and Europe who don't have anything to contribute, and they give those things without question. And these black Americans were ignored, not because they didn't have money, but because the decision was made that these governments don't want to do business with black Americans. Why? Well, the only rational answer to that is embarrassment. So you can keep that not enough money lie. It ain't gonna wash. And what have these African countries done for their own citizens? Have they made opportunities for their own citizens to get what they give to foreigners without question? Even those countries who talk tough, like Zimbabwe and South Africa, rarely actually do land grants for their native people, and they actually have never done an actual large-scale land reclamation program. They'll threaten to do it all day long, they'll threaten nationalization of this, that, and a third, but very rarely do you see them actually following through with it. And that's the reason why you still find the people who colonized and enslaved Africa living off the fat of the land, while the native people are still living in shanties. Malcolm said it, and it's still true today. Land is the basis of freedom, justice, and equality. But it's also the basis of economic stability, too, because land is where you build the things that generate wealth. When you make land acquisitions impossible, you also make it impossible for people to build power plants, heavy industries, or even just brick-and-mortar stores or communities that they control. Now, another bit of phony indignation that the plants and trolls try to spout is that, well, why are you calling all the Africans tethers? First of all, genius, tethers and Africans are not interchangeable terms, any more than Black Americans and coons are. The problem happens to be that not enough work has been done to make tethers and Africans mutually exclusive. That's the problem. There shouldn't be any tethers coming out of Africa at all. There certainly shouldn't be any living there. Now, the Africans and immigrants who happen to listen to the black media, those people from around the world who are B1 no matter where they live, they understand this truth. In fact, they happen to be some of the most aggressive proponents of it. And even these would-be critics and complainers also understand this fact. But let me tell you something. What I see some of these people talking about in my comments is not unity. Unity is not remaining silent while off-code behavior goes down. Unity is not sprinkling sugar on the crap that these tethers, bootlicks, and sellouts from around the world keep shoveling. Unity is not when we decide that we're going to try to make nice with people who are making war against us. When you have people, even at the group level, who are practicing off-code behavior, it doesn't do anyone any favors when we try to pretend that it's not what it clearly is. I check Black Americans most all the time. Hell, my most recent video talking about lies was about Black Americans in specific. And people who I never hear from at any other time think that I'm going to listen because they're all in their feelings over something I said about Africa. It reminds me of the shea butter bootlicks who have absolutely nothing to say when I talk directly about a Roly-Poly Martin or a Don Lemonade or an Officer Eric Adams. But let me say something about Kamala Harris, or perhaps a black female figure, and suddenly the shea butter bootlicks discover their Twitter fingers, and here we go. Neither I nor anyone else is rooting for Africa to fail, unlike a lot of these tethers who are constantly cheerleading for Black Americans to go down. Tethers are the ones who will write Africa off in a heartbeat and not care, because as far as they're concerned, they've escaped. And the reason tethers are such a problem is because they're over here. None of the FBA critics that I see certain people whining about are over there in Africa trying to undermine them. None of us is trying to find a way to do them in or to allow the colonizers to use our wealth in order to help reinforce their wealth, power, and influence. We never allow our melanin to be misused to make excuses for anti-black racism by anti-black racists in Africa. Nor do we try to palm ourselves off as being from Botswana or Namibia or laying claim to any sort of historical lineage from those African countries in an effort to help legitimize white supremacy's attacks on Africa by foreigners. The tethers, on the other hand, do all these things, and they're doing it over here. They're not sitting over in Africa pulling this mess, they're doing it right here where we are, where we live. They are brought here by a malignant racist regime, and those tethers spend every single day claiming that they're somehow part of our lineage, or trying to fool people into thinking that they are, and that they're somehow descended from the survivors of the American Holocaust of slavery, when in reality none of them was here before the turn of the century at all, and the vast majority of them talking the most didn't even show up until the 1960s. The biggest cheerleaders and excuse makers for anti-black racism in America are these tethers. That's a fact. You cannot draw any sort of comparison between them and us because there isn't one. The problem is the people who are trying to pretend as if they care about Africa so much in the comments section, you're not fooling anyone. You can't do anything to help Africa build its economy or social cohesion from Europe or the US. And that's where you're sitting at. You have to be hands-on if you want Africa to be rebuilt. The people you see calling themselves complaining about my commentary are the same people you see sitting in the US or in Britain or Canada, anywhere but Africa, talking about how great things are there, or telling me that Black Americans weren't getting any cooperation because we weren't bringing any money. People who didn't have a pot to pee in, a window to throw it out, or 2 nickels to rub together before they came over here to a place where we made that possible. When the Africans are doing things right, like kicking the US military out of Niger or shutting down Chinese businesses for being racist, then I will highlight that because I want to encourage them when they're getting it right. Not surprisingly at all, the same people with their phony indignation never seem to mention how I prop up Africa when it does it right. They never seem to remember how I do multiple videos like that. But the problem here is far greater than the pathetically selective outrage of a few whining trolls. You have a number of people who are genuinely trying to convince themselves that the situation over there isn't as bad as all that, and that's suicidal. I'm not attacking Africa, because that does no more for me than the tethers and losers who attack black Americans while enjoying the opportunities and rights that we made possible for them. Look, if you want to try to make the argument that Africa does have a few black millionaires, heck, even a couple of billionaires, fine then. But first of all, a few wealthy individuals does not change the fact that the other 99% are poor. Also, those few wealthy Africans, they haven't done anything for anyone but themselves. They don't have an interest in black empowerment. All they're interested in is their Swiss bank accounts and their European mistresses. That's where their interest is at. Hell, most of them don't even spend much time in Africa at all, to say nothing of building up wealth for Africans. They have the same mentality as the colonizers. That's just a fact. So even the ones who you want to try to point to and say, see, there's African success stories here. This ain't about success stories. This is about broad-based prosperity for the people of Africa. And those one or two rich, wealthy Negroes you point to, they haven't done squat for that. And those few millionaires and a couple of billionaires that you try to point to, haven't you noticed that practically all of them are totally connected to those corrupt governments? And not one of them is trying to empower anyone but themselves. They turn out to predictably be family members of government officials, which is where their money came from, or they're otherwise close to the corrupt people in high office. So when you try to make it seem like there are these self-made African success stories, that largely rings hollow. Because none of those African billionaires or millionaires have managed to build a movie studio or a smart city of their own or even a smart village. That's the reason why you got Akon running over there after he spent years building up his wealth in the United States, and the same thing for Idris Elba. Everyone who has a computer or a smartphone or a tablet or any digital device is carrying a piece of Africa in their pockets because the components that are used to make those devices come from the precious minerals that Africa has the lion's share of. So without Africa, you wouldn't have smartphones or smart anything. And yet there's not even one smart street in Africa. Now, isn't there something wrong with this picture? That's the point that I'm trying to make. Africa should be the home of the smart everything. Africa should be the most technologically advanced continent on the planet. Not merely because they have the lion's share of the precious minerals used to make all of the digital devices and toys that you love so much, but also because Africa, if they were smart, would simply decide, you know what, we're going to limit how much the rest of the world can have. You see, this is what the white supremacists did. They decided to go ahead and take over certain areas, and after that, it's a matter of we're going to keep everybody else artificially way beneath us and keep them way behind us by limiting how much they get to have. And that's how they created an artificial situation where they seem to have the lead simply because they made up their minds, hey, if there's going to be all these diamonds out here, well, we're going to take a huge number of those diamonds off the market so that we can artificially prop up the price of the diamonds that we sell. And the same thing goes for the precious metals and everything else. If the Africans decide that they want to be in a position to do that, they could, but they don't. And why is that? Well, just refer back to my earlier comments about what all of these African millionaires and billionaires do whenever they get some money. They're not thinking about building up Africa. They're thinking about going to the south of France. They're thinking about going to Britain. They're thinking about finding anything blonde-haired and blue-eyed up in Scandinavia, and that's their priority. Now, if you want to defend that, which a number of people have done, fine. But don't expect me to join you, because there's nothing defensible about this. You can tell when people have been used to losing for a long while, because instead of them being indignant about it, instead of them having no patience for it and being intolerant of losses, instead they get used to it. That becomes the norm for them. And you know what? People like myself who actually happen to critique what's going on in Africa and happen to be skeptical about some of these Negroes who haven't done anything for Africa before, but who suddenly are showing up and going, oh, I've discovered my African patriotism. You should be glad for people like me. Because I'm trying to keep people honest, and the only thing that's going to save Africa is when people start telling the truth about what's going on over there and why. But if even at this late date you still don't want to hear voices like mine that are simply telling you the unpleasant realities, you can go ahead and listen to some TikTokers who will give you some advice about how you can japa out of Nigeria, or how you can otherwise find a way to leave. Because without voices like mine, that would be the only commentary you'd be hearing about Africa. And if that doesn't bother you, then you're the one who doesn't like Africans or Africa. Good day, and be one. I'd like to take a moment to mention some of our contributors: Michael Gilmore, Sean, Wesley Monroe, Nikki James, and Kenneth Prescia. Salute to them and thank you to everyone for listening, liking, and sharing this message. Black empowerment only exists because of you.